Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Um, we're just about to get started. I'm going to give another minute or two for people to come in. Um, while you're waiting, I'll just introduce myself and introduce our speaker. I'm Tovi Spiro, I'm the Education Director at AWFS. And as always, it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Chris Keuhl, Managing Partner and Co-founder of Armada Corporate Intelligence. Dr. Keuhl is widely recognized for helping businesses and trade associations make sense of economic conditions through forecasting, analysis, and real world insight. His work focuses heavily on manufacturing and the broader forces shaping production, supply chains, labor, business investment, which makes his perspective very important to AWFS community and the wood industry at large. He has a strong academic background from years of teaching economics and finance in the US abroad, and we're really grateful to have him here today to kind of put the state of the economy in context for us as much as it changes minute to minute, and especially what that means for manufacturers and the sectors that are connected to our industry. Dr. Gill, thanks again for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
All right, very good. Thank you. It's very important to start off with the most important observation, which is you cannot trust any economist who is not bald. So I am in good company. We have Uncle Milty here, who is quite obviously bald. So am I. Ben Bernanke was bald too. So there you go. If you hear from an economist that has a full head of hair, don't trust them. So I start off with a discussion that Friedman often had around what is the most important thing when it comes to economics. And he has this quote, which is very accurate. Inflation is the one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation. There are lots of economic issues. There are lots of things that preoccupy manufacturers and consumers and everybody involved with the economy, but none of them are as influential as inflation. And we'll talk quite a bit about why that's the case and what we're expecting as far as inflation is concerned. I mean, the two big threats as far as economics is concerned, recession and inflation. A lot of people preoccupy with recession, but frankly, a lot of companies get through recessions pretty much unscathed. There are lots of sectors that are essentially recession proof. There have been circumstances in past years where companies have grown through a recession. I was reading a study not long ago that of the Fortune 500, over half of them grew or started during a recession. So one of the things that is interesting is that recession tends to be kind of specific. It goes after certain parts of an economy at certain times. Meanwhile, inflation kills everybody, no matter whether you're rich or poor or in between, no matter what industry you're in, inflation affects you. Your prices go up, it challenges what you do with your consumer, etc. So when we talk about some of the challenges that are in front of us right now, inflation end up being sort of the driver of all of the concern behind. It's also one of those things that changes really fast. I mean, you end up with inflationary drivers that almost come out of nowhere, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a minute, but you take something like oil prices. As recently as a month ago, when we talked about fuel prices, that was one of the saving graces of our current circumstances, that we'd been seeing inflation in food, we've saw it in rent, we've seen it in all aspects of the supply chain. But the good news was we didn't see it when it came to fuel. So every time you look at the inflation numbers, it was like, wow, fortunately, we're not seeing a lot of it showing up at the pump. Wow, it's a good thing it's not showing up at the oil markets. Well, that changed. So all of a sudden, you've added a massive inflation spike that is related to the oil markets on top of the inflation that we had already seen. So we'll talk about how that affects the Fed and how it affects some of the decision making that goes from here. So let's start by looking at current quarter 1 data. We just completed it. We're not really going to know what happened in the first quarter for another probably 2 to 3 weeks. We'll get some new data probably next week, but it will be revised, and then it will be revised again, and it may even be revised again after that, because we'll be collecting data really all through the month of April to inform what we saw January, February, March. If you look at last year, the quarterly growth was quite good. I mean, we started out horribly. In the first quarter of last year, we ended up with near recessionary growth. We were something like 0.5% GDP. Kind of unusual. It was triggered quite a bit by the tariff circumstances where companies were desperately trying to get ahead of the tariffs. They were importing as much as they possibly could. And when you look at GDP numbers, remember that GDP stands for gross domestic product. So when you're importing, it pulls down the domestic part of GDP. So when you see a lot of imports, that ends up weakening your GDP numbers. And sure enough, it did in the first quarter of last year. By the second quarter, we started rebounding really strongly. I mean, we were up close to 3.5%. Third quarter was even stronger. We ended up getting very close to 4%, and we were barreling along in the fourth quarter of last year as well until we hit the last month, and that was when we had the government shutdown. We had all kinds of different things that were pulling down GDP. The consumer got a little bit spooked by that government shutdown and other factors, and one of the big drivers for the economy has always been consumption. One of the challenges when you're looking at GDP is that you get lots and lots of determinations and lots of interpretations as to where GDP is headed. Like right now, you got many estimates that are basically saying probably normal rates of GDP growth in the first quarter of this year, 2.5, 2.6, somewhere in that range. That's about our 20-year average. But then you get comments from people like the Commerce Secretary saying, oh no, we're going to grow at 5 or 6%, which is twice as fast as some of the other estimates. Where does the difference come from? It comes down to ifs. It comes down to the qualifiers. So as somebody starts to talk about either the GDP getting worse or getting better, you look for the ifs, where it's like, if this happens, and if this happens, and if this doesn't happen, we will see different numbers when it comes to GDP. The more encouraging numbers are saying, well, we could see a lot more export activity. We could see a response to tax cuts. We could see, well, yeah, we could. Not out of the realm of possibility, but not guaranteed either. What's interesting about GDP, beyond what the actual numbers are, is what it is made up of. And none of this is a great surprise. We are a consumer-driven economy, always have been. It's 80 to 85% of our GDP in any given year. What is interesting is that consumer spending has changed. It has become much more service oriented and much less goods oriented. And this is really down to the boomer. The boomer, since the end of World War II, when the boomers sort of became the dominant factor in the economy, has been thing oriented. You know, we were constantly buying things. We were buying cars and buying houses and buying furniture and buying boats and buying whatever. That carried on really through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. You get into the current time, and now that boomer pretty much has everything they want. So now they're starting to pay for things like getting people to do stuff they don't want to do. I don't want to mow my yard anymore. I don't want to shovel snow anymore. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I'm going to pay somebody else to do it. And the boomer is spending a lot more on healthcare. Healthcare is a service, and so a lot of what's been driving that service activity has been healthcare. And if there's one thing that the boomer is driving harder than anything, it would be healthcare. So now the service part is 72% going on 73. Goods are maybe a third. We also get pretty significant contributions from the government itself. We get it from the export sector. We get it from non-residential fixed investment, but the bulk of it is still the consumer. So we look at things like the tariff. The tariff has kind of fallen out of the headlines, as is often the case. The media goes on to whatever the crisis du jour is, and that tends to be the Middle East right now. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the tariff impact is still front and center. We're still trying to figure out exactly what has taken place. The press has been okay as far as explaining what's going on with tariffs, but not 100% accurate. It has tended to make it seem like the Supreme Court made some definitive statement about tariffs in general. They did not. The Supreme Court only ruled that the one thing that could not be used to impose tariffs was the IEEPA. This was a regulatory device that was put in place years ago basically to deal with financial issues. And from the very beginning, the courts were saying, well, you can't use the IEEPA for this. This is not tariff oriented. This lower court said so. The Customs Court said so. It eventually got to the Supreme Court. They said so. So the only thing that they ruled on is that tariffs are fine. Tariffs are certainly a legitimate part of what countries have done for years to protect their industrial base. You just can't use this tactic. So now what has happened is that all the things that can be used to impose tariffs are being explored. And there are lots of them. I mean, we have the Trade Act of 74, we have the Trade Act of 63, we have the Smoot-Hawley thing from the 1930s, we have the Trade Act of the 1920s. I mean, we've got dozens of these. I've been basically describing the current environment as the Keep in Accountants in Lawyers Employed Act of 2026. We're going to see an awful lot of this stuff being argued in the courts for the rest of the year. There seems to be a consensus that the most likely tariff tactic that will be used now would be Section 232 and Section 301. These are very similar in some respects to what the IEEPA could do. They allow a blanket tariff, but there's a limit. You can only go up to 15%. They allow a very quick response as far as tariff imposition. However, within 150 days, you have to take that tariff to Congress and get them to approve it. So it has built-in limitations. Every single one of the other tariff techniques has a limitation of some kind. Either you can't go over a certain amount, you can only do it for so long, you have to have studies to prove that you're being discriminated against. Every one of them has some kind of proviso that has to be dealt with. The most likely scenario is that middle one, 55% probability, wouldn't change GDP very much, inflation impact probably minor. A lot of where the attention will be focused is who gets a refund on the tariff that they paid earlier in the year. Because now that the IEEPA has been ruled illegal, anyone who paid a tariff under that is entitled to a refund, theoretically. So we'll have to see how that plays out. At last count, there have been 14,000 companies applying for a refund from the tariffs that they paid earlier in the year. So stay tuned. This is going to continue to be an issue all through the rest of the year. So, given the issue around inflation, given what's happening in the Middle East, given all that stuff, what is the Fed thinking right now? So, it's important to sort of remind ourselves what a central bank is for. There's been a lot of controversy, more than usual. I mean, the Fed goes along for years and years without anybody paying a whole lot of attention to it outside the financial markets, but it's become a little bit of a political football of late. Central banks were created in predominantly the 1920s and into the 1930s to do what politicians can't or don't want to do. So when it comes right down to it, the Fed is in the business of controlling inflation. And the reason that it becomes the Fed's job is that controlling inflation means slowing an economy. Inflation is generally a disease of growth. There are other reasons that you get inflation, but it's a situation where demand has exceeded supply. And normally that happens during rapid growth. So one of the reasons that inflation accompanies rapid growth is that you suddenly get a lot of demand, people have money, they want to spend it, and they overwhelm the supply chain. And the supply chain's reaction is to raise prices to control that demand. That creates inflation. So one of the things the Fed does is slow the economy down by restricting money. Now, no politician is going to want to go on the campaign trail and say, hey, I've got a great solution to our economic issue. I'm going to slow the economy down so we can control inflation. And that means that you'll lose your job or your business will go out of business or you won't get paid very much. But hey, I'll control inflation. And the voter says, look for other work, buddy. I don't want the economy to slow down. I want it to grow. That's what politicians like to do. They like to do things like lower taxes and funnel money into the economy through spending programs. They want to see more money in the economy, but that stimulates inflation. So what has been traditionally the solution is to dump that unpleasant job in the laps of the central bank. So what you end up having to do is figure out what the Fed thinks inflation is going to be down the road, and are they in a position to control it? So most of what the Fed is looking at right now is reasonably positive. The unemployment outlook is fairly steady, but it's not getting any better. For a while, we saw quite a lot of improvement, and now that's kind of slowed down. Inflation is currently tame, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. So the Fed is still toying with the idea of lowering rates, not right away, because what they're concerned with now is what's happening in the Middle East. So here's what the Fed looks at. There are lots of different ways to measure inflation. One of the ones that we see very regularly in the press is CPI, PPI, Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index. Those are current. They come out at the beginning of every month, but they're somewhat speculative. They're based on algorithms, they're based on estimates, they're based on partial data, but they come out early. So you can look at them and they'll probably be released, if not later this week, even early next. But they're not as accurate as this one. PCE is personal consumption expenditures. It is what we actually spent on what we actually bought. So it is much more accurate data, but you can see the weakness right away. Look at the date of the last data, January 26. So the Fed right now is looking at what inflation was 2 months ago. So they can only guess what inflation really is now. They won't know for sure what the March inflation is until literally May. So there's always a gap. There's always this lag between PCE numbers. So right now, the Fed is looking at the oil markets and they're saying, okay, we know that there's going to be inflation. We know that the price of gas has gone up. We know that the price of oil has gone up. We don't have it in the data. It's not showing up in PCE yet. It will. And when we start pulling those numbers for March and April, it'll show up. But we don't have them in front of us now. So the current inflation number at the PCE level is 2.4. It's kind of all over the place in terms of what people speculate it might be. It could be as high as 3.5. It could be as low as 3. We're not sure. But the Fed has to react to what it thinks it's going to be down the road, particularly because when you manipulate interest rates, it's not automatic. It's not like you instantly get a response from the economy. It takes months, really, for these interest rate changes to have an impact. So, long and the short of it, the Fed still wants to cut rates, still wants to find a way to stimulate growth. It, however, is a lot more worried about inflation than it used to be. We're probably going to get a changing of the guard when it comes to the Fed relatively soon. Kevin Warsh is on target to be the next Fed chair. And when all that conversation was going on last year and Trump was trying to decide who he wanted as Fed chair, definitely did not want Powell. Powell is not running again. There was concern among the investment community that he might have chosen Kevin Hassett, and Hassett was not considered acceptable to Wall Street and investors. And at the end of the day, it's the Wall Street community that has the biggest influence over who's going to be on the Fed Board of Governors. Kevin Warsh used to be on the Fed. He was a Fed member in, I think, 2006 to 2010 or something like that. When he was on the Fed, he was the liaison to Wall Street. So the Wall Street crowd knows him and trusts him, and that's part of the reason that he ended up being the choice. He's neither hawk nor dove. He's not overly pro interest rate cut, but he's not against it either. So you're likely to see quite a bit of, and he said it himself. He says, I'm data driven. We'll see where the data goes. If it looks like inflation is a problem, well, I'm going to keep the rates either where they are. I might even raise them, though that's unlikely. But if the inflation issue fades and we're out of the oil war and things get better, blah, 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 well, we can look again at cutting rates. So, one of the things that is creating a certain amount of consternation within the economic community is that we're in this kind of weird recovery. We're calling it a K-shaped recovery. And it's not unheard of. We've had this a few times before, but nothing quite as profound as we see now. What this indicates is that we have three different branches basically of recovery. We have an upper level, those who are making 100K or more. We've got a lower level making less than 50K, and then we've got a middle group that's between 50 and 100. Those that are in the upper third, the upper K, they're behaving like they always have. They've noticed inflation, they're complaining about it, but they're not reacting to it. They're still spending. Those that are in the lower, they've been wiped out. Inflation has already basically shoved them out of the economy altogether. They're paying for their necessities with credit cards. They're checked out. 85% living paycheck to paycheck. Those in the middle are doing well if their jobs are secure. Some are, some aren't. So when we get to the employment issue, we can talk more about it. But we're in this weird circumstance where simultaneously we have lots and lots of layoffs, particularly those sectors that are affected by AI. At the same time, and you guys are well aware of this in manufacturing, every manufacturer is desperately looking for people. The trained people that they need and have been losing to retirement, they can't find replacements for. So at one level, you've got people losing jobs, being replaced by AI and technology, and then you've got a whole nother group of companies that are like, we are dying for new workers because we've not done a good job of training for those skills. So which of these drivers is going to be affecting overall economic growth? We don't have a huge buffer when it comes to jobs, and that's particularly the case when we talk about some of the skills that we're looking for. Are people who are in the upper level of the K being affected by the market gyrations? Because most of that money that's in that pay grade, that 100K or more, a lot of it has come from the markets. If the markets correct, if the markets dive for whatever reason, and they keep threatening to. I mean, a week or so ago, NASDAQ announced that it was in correction territory. The Dow hasn't gotten there yet. And it may not. I mean, it just kind of depends how things play out in the Middle East. What also makes the job situation challenging is that we're not altogether sure how to count some of the people that are in the unemployment category. It used to be fairly easy. You know, you had U3, which is one of the main cuts of the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it simply were people who were on unemployment, who were getting unemployment benefits, who were in the system. That is usually what the press reports on. So when you hear the press say the unemployment rate is 4.4 or 4.5, that's U3. U6 is a more comprehensive cut of the BLS data, and it is frequently twice what U3 is. So right now, if you look at U3, it's 4.3, 4.4. U6 is over 8. And U6 picks up two categories that U3 does not. It picks up the involuntary unemployed, and it picks up the discouraged worker. The discouraged worker is the person who's been out of work for a long time and is no longer getting benefits, but they're still looking for work, theoretically. The one that's really tricky is the involuntary part-time. We used to assume that people who were part-time wanted to be full-time, but couldn't find their way into that job. That was before the gig economy. And this is particularly the case with Gen Z. A lot of Gen Z are like, I don't want a full-time job. I don't want a job that minimum wage or whatever it is. I'm just going to do gig work. I'm going to do Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and all the other things I can do on my own. When we ask those people if they're employed, they will frequently say no. I mean, we do the household survey where we ask, is there anybody working in the household? And frequently people will say no. I mean, what do you mean no? You're in that car every day. You're obviously working. It's not a real job. Don't have a boss. Don't have to drive. Don't have to drive tomorrow or next week or next month. It's not a real job. Yes, it is. You're being paid. No, it isn't. I don't have a boss. We don't know how to count them because they're counting themselves in the category that would place them as unemployed. So the U6 rate has been quite a bit higher in the past than it is now just because of the way people are reacting to it. And we'll kind of have to figure out how to accommodate that informal economy sooner than later. Real disposable income is going to indicate where people have money to spend on other than necessities and their bills. So it's not awful at the moment. We're sitting at about 2.9% roughly. Should be a little higher than that. 2.5 is the trigger figure. Anything over 2.5, you begin to see more spending. So we're just barely into that category. We've obviously had better years, 21, 23, but we've had worse. I mean, 25 was barely even 1%. So a lot of variability when it comes to how much personal income people have and what they're doing with it. So kind of referenced this before, but we've got labor waves to be watching. There will be somewhere around 21.722 million baby boomer retirements at the same time that we get 2.3 million new entrants. That is a 20 million person gap. By the end of this decade, by 2030, you have what's being described as the demographic collapse. By now, you have heard some economists talk about the mother of all recessions that's supposed to take place in 2030. To be honest, we can't predict that far in advance. We're doing good to predict next Tuesday, much less 2030. But what most of us are warning about is that demographic collapse. In 2030, every single boomer will have reached retirement age, all 76 million of us. Now, being boomers, we've never had lives, so we just keep working. We work into our 60s, we work into our 70s, work into our 80s. But sooner or later, you wake up and you say, I think I want to enjoy my golden weeks. So maybe I actually will retire now. And you suddenly have a void. You have millions of people leaving the workforce in a short period of time. 26,000 people are added to the Social Security ranks every day. We have the lowest level of workforce participation we've had since the 70s, and that's because of retirement. People are legitimately leaving the workforce because they're retiring. Where do we find replacements? What do we replace them with? And there are no easy answers. I mean, it's not like we can change the child labor laws. It's not like we're going to suddenly grow a whole new population. In the past, we've been able to look at immigration, but the kind of people we need now are skilled and educated, and the vast majority of immigrants don't fit that category. And those that do are being sought after by everybody. The Europeans want them, the Japanese want them, the Chinese want them. So we're struggling. And one of the things that we've been doing to compensate for that loss of labor has been automation and robotics and technology. So we're looking at a pretty substantial transition. I mean, this warning of the demographic collapse has been issued now for years, but nobody's really done anything about it. And it's frustrating. I mean, from the manufacturing perspective, I've been harping on this for the better part of a decade, and it's like, would you please start training people? Every manufacturer I talk to says if the person with the right qualifications walked in my shop, I'd hire them on the spot. But I can't find anybody. The schools are not producing them fast enough. There's too many students that are going off to four-year colleges to get, I mean, right now the efficacy of a four-year college degree has never been lower. This has been the worst year for college hiring in 20 years. It's been the worst year for MBAs in history. Companies are like, I don't need an MBA. I need somebody who can run a machine. I need a welder. I need somebody that can work in construction. I need somebody that can work in transportation. I need these jobs. And are we training for them? No, we haven't, and we haven't for years. So I'll get off my soapbox here any minute now, but it's an issue that we've had time to deal with. It's not like it's a shock. You knew when Junior was going to reach retirement age the moment Junior was born. Just add 65, and you knew when he'd be eligible. The number one way that manufacturers now are recruiting is bringing people out of retirement. So when you're counting, I was talking to a guy the other day that was very excited because he just hired a new machinist and was like thrilled because he was the youngest of the applicants. He was only 71 and the other two were in their 80s. That's not good. That's not long-term planning. So, okay, I promised I'd get off my soapbox. So we get kind of an interesting dichotomy here. Consumer sentiment is weaker, as one would expect. We're worried about inflation, worried about layoffs. Meanwhile, small business sentiment is actually up. So what's accounting for this? And this is partly because the American consumer is very, very odd. We are so different from consumers in every other part of the world. If you're in Europe, if you're in Japan, you're in China, if you start to see economic distress, if you start to worry about your job, if you worry about your financial stability, you begin to get cautious. You begin to save money. You begin to set money aside to cover you if there's a recession. That is not how the American consumer reacts. When the American consumer begins to worry about the economy, our logic seems to be, I might get fired. I might not have an income. I might run out of money. So I had better buy the big screen TV and the car and the boat and all the things that I want now because I won't have any money later. So when I get fired and don't have any money, I'll at least have a new TV and a new car and a new boat to play with. We have literally, and I am not kidding, we have spent our way out of 6 recessions in the last 50 years, where we were headed straight for a recession and the consumer spent its way right out of it. So the logic is when depressed, the depressed go shopping. And we're the only country that does this. Other countries have even tried to get their consumers to do this, and they don't. So the business community is seeing us spend at the same time that we're worried about the future. Gotta love America. So the next few slides here are from Armada. These are some graphs that we've been working on pulling together the last 5 or 6 years. And the accuracy on these has been startling. I mean, I wish I could take more credit for it, but this is down to our model builder who is a retired lieutenant colonel who used to be in the artillery. And he pointed out that in his old job, accuracy was really, really, really important. So he developed a very complicated system of multivariates in order to track his ordnance. And now he uses that same technique to track the economy. So when you look at these two graphs, you've got the one on the left, one on the right. The one on the left is our month-to-month assessment. The line in the middle, the orange line in the middle, is our prediction. The lines to the north and south of it are if those variables change. If they get better than we thought or worse than we thought. If they're better, we get the line to the north. If they're not as good as we thought, we get the line to the south. But look at that graph carefully. The bottom line, the one that is significant, our variables are not as robust as we thought, it's still growing. And if you look at the line to the north, it's practically exponential. And then you look at the graph on the right, we have been pounding along at better than the trend line for the better part of 7 or 8 years. Go back to the 2008-2009 recession, which was the deepest one we've had in recent history. We've been pounding way past that ever since. I mean, we've been on this curve that is just startling because we're still buying and it hasn't slowed down. We're not seeing it slow down this year or next year or even looking into 2028. So the retail side of things is still growing. Now, granted, it's all coming off that upper third and about half of the middle third. We're not seeing the lower third contribute much to this. We're seeing a little bit of contribution from inflation itself. The fact that as people are buying what they're buying, well, it shows up in increased retail activity. But the behavior of that upper third is quite unique. One of the clients that we have is a company that counsels car dealers. So we end up spending a lot of time talking to car dealer groups. And the last one that I went to, I was asking, I said, oh, look, the average price of a car now is 50 grand. That's pretty inflated. So is that affecting your sales? And the guy said, well, it depends. It says, if I'm trying to sell an inexpensive car, which would be aimed at that lower third or maybe the middle third, that thing will sit on the lot for weeks, if not months. I can't sell it because the people that would be interested in that car don't have a lot of money. On the other hand, if I get a high-end car, that thing will be on the lot for a day or two at most. He said, I had a guy come into my dealership and was looking at an $80,000 Beamer. Didn't see him for several months. When he came back, that same Beamer was now 120,000. And so I said, are you still interested? And he said, yeah. He said, it's 40 grand more than it was. Yeah, I can see that. I can read. Why would you think that matters to me? He said, I'm rich, you idiot. He says, do you think I'm so stupid that I don't realize that I can take much less expensive car to get from point A to point B? That car is not a car. It is a status symbol. I have a 4-car garage. It is never going to be in it because that car is going to be in the driveway so my neighbor can look at it every morning and realize what a loser he is. That car is a status symbol. The fact that it's now 120,000 instead of 80 makes it more valuable to me than it was before. So people who are in the upper income categories don't spend for the same reason. They're spending for status. They're spending for personal reasons. I mean, we all of us do this to a certain extent or the other, but I mean, it just totally different motivation, and it drives retail activity at a high level. When you look at corporate spending, we're seeing a lot of that development too. That has not slowed down for 2 decades. I mean, we continue to see these numbers, and they're growing again. They've been driven by everything from the transportation sector, logistics centers, break bulk facilities, warehouses, the whole bit. Now it's being driven by data center spending and everything around it. So it's not just data centers, but it's the energy development that goes along with it. The prediction at one point was that we needed 42 to 43 terawatts of additional power to handle AI. Now think about that for a minute. The average power plant in the United States, if it ran 365 days a year continuously with no shutdowns, is going to produce somewhere around 800,000 to 900,000 megawatts, which is a fraction of a terawatt. So you're sitting there saying, we need to build that much capacity. There's no way. There's no way we're going to build that much, but we're going to have to try because every place that's developing data centers needs power. And one of the reasons that you're seeing the controversy over data centers is where is this power going to come from and who's going to pay for it? I mean, the entire energy conversation has changed so radically in the last 10 years. We at one point were with the perfectly straight face talking about solar and wind becoming dominant. There's still going to be players, but we're now talking everything: oil, gas, coal. The fastest growing technology is nuclear. Because if you want to deal with any of the issues of energy need and the issues of climate change, it's going to be nuclear. And that's a whole different conversation, which we could probably spend weeks on, but time is of the essence. So non-residential construction, which kind of reflects all that activity at the corporate level, still growing like crazy. I mean, we had a period there where it was nearly exponential. kind of came off that peak briefly, but now it's growing again. And it's growing for the same reasons that we saw it grow before. It's data centers, it's warehousing, it's all that stuff that goes in with non-residential. And that has all kinds of implications for the consumption of things like steel and aluminum and copper and all the sort of things that go into construction. When you look at things like the residential market, what you want to keep your eye on is the bond market. The media got all excited last fall when the interest rates came down by a quarter. And I remember looking at the TV going, would you people understand how this works? The bond market is what drives residential housing, not the Fed. The Fed can lower interest rates all at once. It has an impact on the non-residential side, but the residential side reacts to the bond market. When the bond yield falls below 4%, that's kind of the magic number. No real reason for it to be the magic number, but it is. When it falls below 4, mortgages come down. And when it briefly fell below 4 a few weeks ago, actually, you saw a lot of refis, you saw a lot of new applications for housing, but then it bounced back up over 4 and that shut off. So right now, the bond market is reacting to what's happening in the Middle East and the yield's gone back up. When you look at things like Fab metal has been in a decline for a long time, but erratically. And basically, it's just reacting to replacements that you're finding more use of plastics, you're finding more use of ceramics, you're finding alternatives to fab metal. But the healthcare sector loves fabricated metal. And as the fabs metal growth has taken place, it's largely been around the healthcare sector. Residential construction, as I said, it's kind of getting back into a bit of a rhythm, but it always looks like an EKG. I mean, it's so ephemeral. It just changes from one day to the next. A lot of what's driving residential is migration. People are leaving high cost of living states for low cost of living states. So they're exiting the West Coast, they're leaving the Northeast, they're moving to the Midwest. A study was done not long ago asking a simple question: how much would you have to make to live a comfortable life as a single person in every state in the union? So to live that quote comfortable life in California, you would need to make $200,000 a year as a single person. To live that same comfortable life in North Dakota, 50,000. So suddenly, Fargo is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, and I'm not kidding. I'm the economist for the North Dakota Society of CPAs, and I get to go to Fargo every January. Yay me! And they just are astonished at how much activity takes place in their state. Have a friend that just decided to retire to Fargo, 75 years old, and people looked at him like he was nuts. And he said, "Look, I'm old. I don't do beaches anymore. I don't do any of that stuff. What I like to do is bowl, and I like to swim, and I like to watch movies." And somebody built a house up here that has an indoor bowling alley, an indoor swimming pool, and an indoor little theater, and I picked it up for $400,000, and I know there's going to be 85 feet of snow and it's going to be 40 degrees below zero. I don't care. I'm going to swim and bowl and watch movies, and the house came with 2 snowmobiles, so what else do I need? So, by the way, if you ever do find yourself in Fargo in January, one of the things they like to do up there is they have these pop-up bars that are in the middle of nowhere that you can only access on a snowmobile. So you can ride out there in the snowmobile, you can drink to your heart's content, and what's the worst that can happen on the way home? You just put it into a drift and they find you next spring. So there you go. That's entertainment. So manufacturing has been growing, much to the shock of people who thought manufacturing was dead. It came storming back after the pandemic and is almost now back to where it was prior to the pandemic. A lot of export-driven activity, but a lot of this is companies that are turning to automation and robotics to replace the people they can't find. It is predicted by the end of this decade that 1 in every 3 households will have a domestic robot that will be cooking and cleaning and doing household chores and mostly keeping track of the elderly residents in that home. So boomers are getting to the point where we need help and we're going to have to get it from somewhere. I always knew this was coming, but this last year has been eye-opening since I had back surgery about a year ago, which has been a very slow process. There's a lot of stuff I can't do yet. And there's a lot of stuff where I'm having to rely on all kinds of things. I haven't gone robotic quite yet, but it's been tempting. And I have friends who are dealing with relatives that have Alzheimer's. And it's like, what do you do? I mean, if you've got somebody that has to be monitored 24/7, do you put them into a very expensive facility? Do you move them in with you and keep your eye on them 24/7? Or do you do what a friend of mine did with a experimental program? His grandfather, or his father rather, has a robot that keeps him company every second of every day and just monitors him constantly. It's become his best friend. They watch TV together, they go for walks together. The robot is just constantly there, and if something looks astray, it makes contact with somebody to help. I mean, we're going to learn at some point that the Jetsons was not a cartoon, it was a documentary. So automotive continuing to grow. It's not yet back up to the trend line, but it was supposed to have fallen by now. The price of a car would have been prohibitive. It's not really working out that way. Computers and electronics. Wow, who would imagine this would grow? So it's been almost exponential. It's just been pounding along like crazy since 2009, and we all know why. It's just that's been the change. I mean, AI alone has been driving it to the current levels. We started doing this as kind of a way to gauge where the economy goes from one year to the next. So we've got green, yellow, red. The green, either rapid growth or modest growth. The yellow is kind of modest, kind of flat growth, and then red is contracting. So you look at our national forecast. This is very encouraging. No red. There's no indication that any of these sectors are going into contraction. Overall, pretty middle of the road, not a lot of growth, but not any contraction. But then you look at things like data centers, green in 26 and 27, power generation, green in 26 and 27, healthcare, green in 26 and 27, education, green. Everybody else, middle of the road, yellow. So whether it's manufacturing, commercial, residential, non-residential, a lot of basically stable activity and several sectors where there's definite expansion. Global manufacturing has also started to peak. 2 months ago, if you had looked at the Purchasing Managers Index, which is what this is, you would have seen 16 countries in contraction. Now there are 4. So in 2 months' time, you've seen almost every country in the world get into expansion. Anything over 50 indicates expansion. Anything under 50 is contraction. These are not huge numbers. They're not, in most cases, much above 51, 52. There are some exceptions, but they're not in the 40s. And they've recently come out of the 40s. There's only been a few that have seen their numbers decline. And this is radically different from what we saw even a couple of months ago. The global supply chain index is looking relatively healthy. We're a little bit worried about what happens from here as far as oil is concerned. The thing with oil, probably not enough time to go into gory detail. We are not looking at an oil shortage. We were very concerned about an oil glut even 2 months ago. We were very concerned that we weren't consuming enough oil. We were producing more than we needed. And the prediction was that we were going to see prices in the $50 to $45 a barrel range, which sounds great, except that U.S. producers can't make money if it's not over 60. So there was a lot of concern that we were going to be sliding into another Houston recession where the prices got too low. We're not worried about that now. Prices per barrel is up around 110 right now. But the entire issue is transportation, not supply. There is plenty of oil. There's more oil than we need. The U.S. is the biggest oil producer in the world now, crude oil. We still import a lot of refined product, but there's lots and lots and lots of oil. It just can't get to where it needs to go. So we're dealing with a transportation issue. 20 to 30% of all the oil that's produced in the world goes through the Straits of Hormuz, and right now none of it can get through. And the reason for that is basically economics. It's insurance companies. It's not that we think every tanker is going to get sunk. We just know that they're vulnerable. And if one of them gets hit and you end up with an oil spill, the insurance company is on the hook for that. So the insurance company is saying, we're not touching any of these. So unless you end up with some kind of a ceasefire or protection, we are not insuring anything that goes through the Straits of Hormuz. They're not insuring anything that goes through the Red Sea right now. So it comes down to opening up the waterways. What that does from a supply point of view is that if this was an actual shortage of oil, it would take months to build the reserves back up. What we're looking at now is you open up the waterways and the oil crisis ends in a matter of days because all of a sudden ships can get through, they can move the oil where it's needed, etc. So this is one of those things where if the right circumstances develop, that crisis ends almost overnight. So the aftermath becomes interesting. Will there be a plummeting in oil prices? Probably. How much? Hard to tell. Will it come down as far as it's been? Unlikely, not at least right away. Are there going to be more attacks in terms of local battles? Will the Iranians still attack Dubai and Qatar and other, who knows? How will it take to open up these waterways, etc. So, and will there be reconstruction? There's just so many unanswered questions right now because we don't really even know what the goal is as far as the participants. What would Iran consider a ceasefire? What are we considering? Do we want the threat to end and to kind of emasculate Iran and walk away? Or do we want a regime change? And if we do, who do we want to be in power and why? Lots of questions. So, last couple of things, chip shortages will also be an issue because a lot of what supports the chip industry comes out of the Middle East. There's a lot of materials, for example, helium and bromine and others that come from that region. And if there's an inhibition in that supply chain, it percolates through pretty quickly in the chip business. Just kind of to depress the heck out of you. Student loans are out of control. So what a shock. We've only been hearing about that for a while. So we're still not quite sure how that's going to play out. What mostly concerns the business community is the upper third of loan possessors. The ones that are at the bottom of the heap aren't big spenders anyway, but you've got people that took out student loans who are in conceivably that upper third. Is this going to inhibit them from doing things like buying homes, buying cars, buying, to some extent, yes, it's been difficult to determine just how much. But the good news is we've not seen a lot of damage when it comes to foreclosures. We've not seen a lot of problems with revolving loans. We're not seeing a lot of problems even with auto loans. Credit cards have leveled off. That's been a real problem, but now it's kind of flattened out. So the one thing that's still growing has been the student loan. And then finally, just because everybody is talking about AI, and so here's the Gartner hype cycle, which I'm sure by now you're familiar with. It's been out for years. This has been applied to everything from when the PC first came on and replaced mainframes. It was used to describe when the internet came along and cell phones came along. You have this pattern that shows up every time. You get a technology trigger, right now that's AI, and in the beginning, people are like, oh my God, this is going to change the world. It's going to make everything just completely different, and nothing will ever be the same. And this surges all the way up to the peak of inflated expectations. And people put way too much credibility, way too much emphasis on it, which is then followed by the trough of disillusionment. So people start looking at it going, wait a minute, it doesn't do that at all. It's terrible at this. It's hallucinating. It's doing all kinds of weird stuff. According to Gartner, we're about halfway down that slope. So we've reached the peak. Now we're coming towards the trough of disillusionment. We haven't hit bottom yet. Once we do, then it comes back up, and we start to get what we call the slope of enlightenment, where people start to say, it doesn't do everything, but it does a lot of things really well. And if I can learn how to use the parts that work and avoid the parts that don't, then I reach the plateau of productivity, which is where you want to be, which is where it becomes a tool. And it's, if you want to just go back and revisit some of the old technologies, I was reading not long ago all of the expectations as to how we were going to use cell phones, and how this was going to just literally radicalize everything. Nobody anticipated at the time that the number one usage of a cell phone would be for teenage girls to send pictures of themselves to their friends. So it's like, what? You're taking this modern technology, and the number one thing you want to do with it is take a selfie? Yeah, well, that's kind of the way the world goes. So with that, the summary is pretty quick. We've got a lot of things to worry about. We're looking at the Fed, trying to figure out what they're going to do. We have a bifurcated economy, a lot of growth in the economy, but it's kind of concentrated. It's not a universal distribution. And then the supply chain is something that could change quickly, both negatively and positively. And with that, I'm going to shut up and turn it back over to Toby.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Anybody, if you have any questions, you can click up at the top the Q&A and enter in any questions that you have. I definitely encourage you to go check out Armada through that QR code or the website down below. I know we really value it, and we send that out to our members every week. So again,
And
if you
by
have
the way,
any
if you have
questions.
questions later, this is my observation. People come up with this stuff like a week later, and they're like, dang it, I wish I'd asked. Just send me an email. I'm down there at the bottom, Chris Keuhl, and I can guarantee you that I am just as verbose in print as I am in public. So feel free to ask me a question, and you will get. Remember that my father was an engineer, and I learned really early never to ask him a question because the answer would go on for a day and a half. So I'm my father's son.
All right, it looks like we don't have any questions. So unless anybody has something to add, I just want to, Chris, thank you again for
Thank you.
coming, and we will check in with you next time.
Very good. Thanks. Enjoy your
All right.
weekend. It's a long weekend, hopefully.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.